In the small, quiet town of Meadowbrook, life moved at a pace as gentle as the breeze that swept through its rolling hills. The air carried the earthy scent of hay and wildflowers, while distant sounds of birdsong blended with the occasional whinny of horses. It was here, amidst this serene landscape, that Arthur Swift had built his life, a life deeply intertwined with the majestic creatures he loved so dearly. Arthur's ranch sprawled across acres of lush green fields dotted with sturdy oak trees. Every morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Arthur would step out onto the porch of his modest farmhouse. With a steaming cup of coffee in hand, he'd take a moment to soak in the beauty around him before beginning his day. His mornings always started the same way, feeding the horses, checking their health, and ensuring each one felt safe and cared for. The ranch wasn't just a business for Arthur, it was his sanctuary. Over 50 horses called Swift Ranch home, some spirited and fiery, others calm and gentle, but all were treated like family. From sleek Arabian stallions to sturdy quarter horses, every animal had a unique personality that Arthur cherished. He knew them by name, understood their quirks, and could tell when something was amiss simply by the flick of an ear or the shuffle of a hoof. For years, life on the ranch had been peaceful. Neighbors often stopped by to admire the horses or seek advice from Arthur, who was known far and wide for his expertise. People respected him not only because of his knowledge, but also because of the kindness he extended to everyone. Whether it was helping a struggling farmer mend a fence or offering shelter to a lost traveler during a storm, Arthur believed in doing what was right, no matter how small the gesture. But beneath the surface of this idyllic existence lay a quiet strength. Arthur's love for his horses was matched only by his determination to protect them. He had faced challenges before: harsh winters, financial struggles, even the loss of a beloved mare, but nothing had shaken his resolve. To him, these animals weren't mere possessions. They were living beings deserving of care, respect, and freedom. Despite his busy schedule, Arthur made time to teach young riders about horsemanship. On weekends, children from nearby farms would gather at the ranch, eager to learn under his patient guidance. Horses are more than animals, he'd say, his voice warm yet firm. They're partners. Treat them well, and they'll give you their trust. Watching those kids grow confident atop a horse brought Arthur immense joy. It reminded him why he chose this life. Yet, even in such tranquility, whispers of change began to ripple through Meadowbrook. Rumors spread of newcomers arriving in town, bringing with them unfamiliar faces and intentions. Some locals dismissed these tales as idle gossip, but Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was about to disrupt the harmony he held so dear. As days passed, Arthur found himself glancing toward the horizon more often, wondering what lay beyond the familiar stretch of land. Little did he know, his instincts were spot on. Change was indeed coming, and it wouldn't be long before the peace of Swift Ranch was tested in ways Arthur never imagined. One sunny afternoon, as Arthur was inspecting the paddocks and making sure the horses had enough shade to rest under, a strange sound broke the usual calm of the ranch. It wasn't the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves or the rustling of leaves. It was the low rumble of an engine. Squinting against the sunlight, Arthur turned toward the dirt road leading to his property. A dusty pickup truck rolled into view, its tires kicking up clouds of dry earth. The vehicle came to a stop near the barn, and out stepped a man who looked entirely out of place in Meadowbrook. The stranger introduced himself as Victor Kane, a horse trader passing through town. His clothes were worn but clean, and his boots bore the scuffs of many miles traveled. At first glance, he seemed harmless enough, just another wanderer looking to make a deal. But there was something about him that made Arthur uneasy. Victor's sharp eyes scanned the ranch with a calculating gaze, lingering on the horses grazing in the fields. His handshake was firm, almost too firm, and his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Victor wasted no time getting to the point. "I hear you've got some fine stock here," he said, his tone casual but tinged with impatience. "I'm in the market for strong stallions, ones that can handle tough terrain and long journeys. You got anything like that? Arthur nodded politely, though his guard was already up. We do have some good horses, he replied cautiously, but they're not just commodities. Each one has been raised with care. If you're serious about buying, I'd need to know more about what you're planning to do with them. Victor waved a hand dismissively, as if Arthur's concerns were irrelevant. Look, I don't need a lecture on ethics. I just want 2 of your best stallions. Name your price. His abruptness caught Arthur off guard, but he remained composed. I appreciate your interest, Arthur said evenly, but my horses aren't for sale unless I'm confident they're going to a good home. They're part of this ranch, and I take their well-being seriously. Victor's expression darkened, and for a brief moment, Arthur thought he saw anger flash in the man's eyes. But just as quickly, Victor forced a smirk. You're making a mistake, he muttered, his voice low and threatening. You'll regret turning me down. Unfazed, Arthur crossed his arms over his chest. I don't respond well to threats, Mr. Kane. This is my land, and these are my horses. If you're looking for someone who'll sell without asking questions, you won't find it here. For a few tense seconds, the 2 men stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken hostility. Finally, Victor let out a harsh laugh, breaking the silence. Fine. Have it your way, he snapped, climbing back into his truck. As the engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped away, kicking up even more dust, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. Later that evening, as Arthur sat on the porch watching the sunset, he replayed the conversation in his mind. Something about Victor felt wrong. The man's demeanor, his refusal to answer basic questions about his intentions, it all added up to trouble. Arthur knew he should trust his instincts, but he also reminded himself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe Victor really was just a traveler passing through, frustrated by rejection. Or maybe he was exactly what Arthur feared, someone who wouldn't hesitate to cross lines to get what he wanted. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle above the ranch, Arthur resolved to stay vigilant. Whatever lay ahead, he was determined to protect his horses and his peace of mind at all costs. The days that followed Victor Kane's visit were anything but ordinary at Swift Ranch. At first, everything seemed calm. Too calm, in fact. The horses grazed lazily under the midday sun, and the field stretched out as far as the eye could see, untouched by any sign of trouble. But Arthur couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest like a stone. He'd spent years trusting his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him to stay alert. It started subtly, a broken fence post here, a snapped wire there. At first glance, it looked like wear and tear, the kind of minor damage that came with owning a large ranch. But when Arthur inspected the repairs he'd made just days earlier, only to find them tampered with again, he knew something was off. Whoever, or whatever, was causing this wasn't natural. Then came the water troughs. One morning, Arthur noticed that several of them were bone dry, despite being filled the night before. It wasn't a simple oversight. Someone had deliberately drained them. The horses, sensing the disruption, grew restless. Even Thunder, usually the most composed of the herd, paced nervously near the gate, his ears flicking back and forth as if expecting danger. Arthur tried to stay calm, reminding himself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was teenagers playing pranks, or perhaps an animal had gotten into the paddocks and caused chaos. But deep down, he suspected otherwise. Each incident felt calculated, designed to unsettle him, and worse, to harm the horses. Determined to get answers, Arthur decided to take action. He installed extra security cameras around the perimeter of the ranch, positioning them strategically to cover blind spots. He also hired one of his trusted ranch hands, Ben, to patrol the grounds during the night. Keep your eyes open, Arthur instructed. If you see anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call me. Despite these precautions, the disturbances continued. One evening, as Arthur walked through the stables checking on the horses, He found hoof prints in the dirt leading away from the barn. They weren't from his own animals. They belonged to someone else's horse. Following the trail, he discovered fresh tire marks near the edge of the property, partially hidden by tall grass. Someone had been here recently, and they hadn't come peacefully. Word of the strange happenings spread quickly through Meadowbrook. Some townsfolk sympathized with Arthur, urging him to report the incidents to Sheriff Daniels. Others, however, whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether Arthur was overreacting. "Maybe it's just bad luck," one neighbor suggested cautiously. "Things break all the time on farms." But Arthur knew better. Bad luck didn't explain the deliberate nature of the sabotage, and while he appreciated the concern, he couldn't ignore the growing suspicion gnawing at him. Was Victor Kane behind this? The man's parting words echoed in Arthur's mind. "You'll regret turning me down." As the days turned into weeks, Arthur wrestled with doubt. Was he letting paranoia cloud his judgment? Or was he dealing with someone truly dangerous? The lack of concrete evidence frustrated him, but he refused to back down. Every time he looked into the eyes of his horses, the trust they placed in him, it reinforced his resolve. Whatever was happening, he would protect them, no matter what it took. Late one night, as Arthur sat alone in the dim light of the kitchen, staring at grainy footage from the security cameras, he made a silent promise. If Victor Kane, or anyone else, thought they could intimidate him or harm his horses, they were sorely mistaken. This ranch was more than just land and animals. It was his life, his purpose, and Arthur Swift wasn't about to let anyone take that away. Arthur had always prided himself on being a man of patience and reason. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when their actions raised red flags. But as the disturbances at Swift Ranch continued, his tolerance began to wear thin. The broken fences, drained water troughs, and restless horses weren't just inconveniences, they were threats. And Arthur wasn't about to sit idly by while someone toyed with his livelihood. Determined to confront the source of the trouble head-on, Arthur decided it was time to track down Victor Kane. If the man truly was behind the sabotage, Arthur wanted answers, and he intended to get them face to face. After asking around town, he learned that Victor frequented the local saloon, a dimly lit establishment on the edge of Meadowbrook where travelers and drifters often gathered. It wasn't the kind of place Arthur usually visited, but tonight he had no choice. The saloon was smoky and noisy, filled with the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation. Arthur stepped inside, his boots thudding against the wooden floorboards. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Victor, seated alone at a corner table. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat in front of him, and his expression was sour, as though the world had wronged him personally. Arthur approached cautiously, but deliberately, pulling out a chair across from Victor without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. Victor glanced up, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "What do you want?" he snapped, leaning back in his chair. His tone carried a mix of arrogance and irritation, as if Arthur's presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. "I think you know why I'm here," Arthur replied, keeping his temper in check. "Things have been happening at my ranch. Broken fences, empty water troughs, signs of trespassing. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Victor smirked, swirling the liquor in his glass before taking a slow sip. "Sounds like bad luck to me," he drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "Maybe your ranch is falling apart because you're too busy playing hero instead of fixing what matters." Arthur clenched his jaw, but forced himself to stay calm. "Don't insult my intelligence, Victor. I've seen tire tracks near my property, hoof prints that don't belong to my horses. Someone's been there, and I'm not convinced it's coincidence." Victor leaned forward suddenly, his smirk fading into a scowl. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Walking around this town like you own the place, acting all high and mighty because you've got a few pretty horses. Let me tell you something, you're nothing special." The tension between them crackled like electricity. Arthur could feel the weight of every eye in the saloon turning toward their table, But he didn't care. This wasn't just about pride. It was about protecting what mattered most to him. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you're trying to intimidate me or hurt my horses, you picked the wrong fight. I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for." Victor laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you? Those horses are just animals. They're tools, nothing more. You act like they're family. But guess what? In the real world, feelings don't pay the bills." Arthur's hands tightened into fists under the table, but he refused to rise to the bait. Instead, he stood up slowly, towering over Victor. "Mark my words, if you come near my ranch again, there will be consequences. Stay away from my horses, or you'll regret it." With that, Arthur turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving Victor glaring after him. As he stepped into the cool night air, he felt a mix of anger and determination coursing through him. The confrontation hadn't given him any concrete answers, but one thing was clear: Victor Kane wasn't going to back down easily. Whatever happened next, Arthur knew he'd have to be ready. For himself, for his ranch, and for the horses who depended on him. After the heated confrontation at the saloon, Arthur returned to Swift Ranch with his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Victor's smug grin or the thinly veiled threats in his words. Something about the man's demeanor told Arthur that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But instead of letting frustration consume him, Arthur decided it was time to bring someone he trusted into the fold: Emily Carter. Emily had been a close friend for years, ever since she first visited the ranch to treat an injured mare. A skilled veterinarian with a sharp mind and a kind heart, she understood horses almost as well as Arthur did. More importantly, she knew how much the animals meant to him. When Arthur called her late that night, explaining everything that had happened, from the sabotage to the tense exchange with Victor, she didn't hesitate to offer her help. "I'll come by first thing tomorrow," Emily said firmly over the phone. "We'll figure this out together." True to her word, Emily arrived early the next morning, armed with not only her medical kit, but also a notebook and a keen eye for detail. Together, they reviewed the security footage Arthur had collected. The grainy images showed little more than shadows moving near the stables late at night, but Emily pointed out subtle clues: a glint of light reflecting off metal tools, the faint outline of boots that hinted at deliberate intent. "This isn't random vandalism," Emily said, her brow furrowed as she studied the screen. "Whoever is doing this knows what they're after. They're targeting your horses, Arthur. And if we don't stop them soon, things could get worse." Her words sent a chill down Arthur's spine, but they also reinforced his determination. With Emily's guidance, they devised a plan. First, they decided to reinforce the weakest points of the ranch's perimeter, areas where fences were most vulnerable. Next, Emily suggested setting up motion-activated lights around the stables. "If anyone tries to sneak around at night, they'll light up like a Christmas tree," she explained with a small smile. But perhaps the most important step was reaching out to Sheriff Daniels. Though Arthur had initially resisted involving law enforcement, Emily convinced him that it was necessary. "You can't handle this alone," she said gently. "And if something happens to the horses, or even to you, we'll regret waiting too long." Reluctantly, Arthur agreed. That afternoon, he met with Sheriff Daniels at the ranch. The sheriff, a grizzled yet fair-minded man named Tom, listened intently as Arthur recounted the events leading up to the present moment. To Arthur's relief, Sheriff Daniels took the situation seriously. "I've heard whispers about Kane," the sheriff admitted. "He's got a reputation for stirring up trouble wherever he goes. Leave this with me. I'll keep an eye on him." As the day drew to a close, Arthur felt a flicker of hope. With Emily's support and the sheriff's involvement, he no longer felt like he was fighting this battle alone. Still, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Every creak of the wind, every rustle in the grass, made him wonder if danger lurked just beyond sight. That night, as Arthur stood on the porch watching the stars, Emily joined him, Her arms crossed against the cool breeze. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. "Protecting those horses, it's who you are. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Arthur nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I just hope it's enough," he murmured. Emily placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It will be. We're in this together." For the first time in days, Arthur allowed himself a small smile. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wasn't facing them alone. And with friends like Emily and Sheriff Daniels by his side, he felt ready to take on whatever came next, for the sake of his horses and the life he built at Swift Ranch. It was a cold, moonless night when the tension at Swift Ranch finally reached its breaking point. Arthur had been lying awake in bed, unable to shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, but his instincts screamed at him to get up and check on the horses. Slipping into his boots and grabbing a flashlight, he stepped outside into the chilly darkness. The ranch looked eerily still under the cover of night. The usual sounds, the soft whinnies of horses, the rustling of leaves, were absent, replaced by an unsettling silence. As Arthur made his way toward the stables, his heart sank. One of the gates was wide open, swinging loosely on its hinges as if it had been forced apart. Panic surged through him as he hurried inside, shining the flashlight around the empty stalls. 3 horses were missing, including Thunder, his prized stallion. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He immediately called Emily, who promised to meet him at the ranch within minutes. Then, with trembling hands, he dialed Sheriff Daniels. "They've taken them," Arthur said, his voice tight with urgency. "Someone broke in and stole 3 of my horses." Sheriff Daniels arrived quickly, his truck headlights cutting through the darkness. Together, they began searching for clues. Tire tracks led away from the property, disappearing down a narrow dirt road that wound toward the outskirts of Meadowbrook. Following the trail, they drove cautiously, their headlights illuminating the barren landscape until they reached an abandoned barn half hidden by overgrown weeds. As they approached, the sound of muffled hoofbeats confirmed their worst fears. Inside the dilapidated structure, they found the stolen horses tied up in cramped, filthy conditions. Thunder stood near the back, his coat dull and his eyes wide with fear. Arthur rushed to untie him, murmuring soothing words as he gently stroked the stallion's neck. "It's okay, boy," he whispered. "You're safe now." But what shocked them even more was the sight of Victor Kane standing nearby, attempting to load another horse onto a rickety trailer. Caught red-handed, Victor froze, his face pale in the glow of the sheriff's flashlight. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Arthur stepped forward, his fists clenched but his voice steady. "What did you think you were going to do, Victor? Sell them off like pieces of junk?" Victor tried to bluster his way out of the situation, his tone defiant despite the evidence against him. "I don't know what you're talking about. These horses wandered here. I was just trying to help." But his lies crumbled under the weight of the facts. The cut fence wires, the tire tracks, and the terrified animals all pointed to one conclusion. Victor Kane was guilty. Sheriff Daniels moved swiftly, handcuffing Victor and reading him his rights. "You're under arrest for theft, trespassing, and animal cruelty," the sheriff said firmly. As Victor was led away, protesting loudly, Arthur turned his attention back to the horses. With Emily's help, they carefully loaded the animals into a trailer to bring them home. Each step felt like a victory, a reclaiming of what had been stolen. On the drive back to the ranch, Arthur sat quietly, his emotions swirling. Relief washed over him, knowing the horses were safe, but anger simmered beneath the surface. How could someone treat living creatures with such disregard? And how close had he come to losing them forever? When they finally returned to Swift Ranch, the first rays of dawn were beginning to break over the horizon. The sight of Thunder stepping out of the trailer and galloping freely across the pasture filled Arthur with a sense of peace and resolve. This ordeal wasn't just about protecting his horses. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Though the nightmare was over, Arthur knew the scars would remain. for the horses, for the ranch, and for himself. But as he watched Thunder toss his head proudly under the morning light, Arthur reminded himself of one thing. No matter how dark things got, there was always hope as long as you refused to give up. The arrest of Victor Kane sent ripples through Meadowbrook, stirring up a mix of emotions among the townsfolk. Some were relieved to see justice served, while others whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether Arthur had overreacted or been too confrontational. For Arthur, though, the aftermath wasn't about vindication, it was about healing. The events of the past weeks had left scars not only on his ranch, but also within the community he called home. Victor's trial was swift and decisive, with overwhelming evidence against him, including fingerprints on tools used to damage fences, tire tracks leading directly to the abandoned barn, and witness accounts from Sheriff Daniels. There was little room for doubt. Victor was convicted of theft, trespassing, and animal cruelty, sentenced to several years in prison. As the gavel fell in the courtroom, Arthur felt a sense of closure wash over him. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the lingering unease that clung to the edges of his mind. Back at Swift Ranch, life slowly began to return to normal. The stolen horses were recovering well under Emily's care, their spirits lifting with each passing day. Thunder, once agitated and fearful, now galloped freely across the fields again, his mane catching the sunlight like a golden flame. Watching him, Arthur couldn't help but smile. These animals weren't just livestock. They were survivors, just like him. But the incident had shaken more than just the horses. Neighbors who had once trusted Arthur without question now seemed hesitant, unsure of how to reconcile his actions during the ordeal. Some viewed him as a hero for standing his ground. Others saw him as overly aggressive, perhaps even paranoid. Arthur understood their confusion. He'd questioned himself plenty of times throughout the ordeal, but he refused to apologize for protecting what mattered most. Determined to rebuild trust, Arthur decided to open his ranch to the community in ways he never had before. He organized open days, inviting neighbors and curious visitors to tour the property, meet the horses, and learn about equine care. On these days, the ranch buzzed with activity. Children giggled as they petted gentle mares, while adults marveled at the strength and grace of the stallions. Arthur took the time to answer every question, sharing stories about the horses and explaining why their well-being meant so much to him. One visitor, an elderly woman named Margaret, approached Arthur after watching Thunder trot around the paddock. Her eyes sparkled with admiration as she spoke. "You really love these animals, don't you?" she asked softly. Arthur nodded, smiling warmly. "They're family," he replied simply, "and I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe." These small moments reminded Arthur of why he'd fought so hard, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Over time, the skepticism that had lingered in town began to fade. People started seeing Arthur not as confrontational, but as someone who stood by his principles, no matter the cost. Even Sheriff Daniels stopped by one afternoon to commend Arthur for his courage. "Not everyone would have gone through what you did," the sheriff said, tipping his hat respectfully. "You didn't just protect your horses, you set an example for all of us." As the seasons changed and the fields turned golden with autumn grasses, Arthur found solace in the rhythm of ranch life. Though the memory of Victor's betrayal still lingered, it no longer weighed heavily on his heart. Instead, it served as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and resilience. Late one evening, as Arthur sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, he reflected on everything that had happened. Life had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also shown him the strength of his convictions and the power of community. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he could face them head-on, surrounded by the people and animals who made Swift Ranch a true home. As the weeks turned into months, life at Swift Ranch settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and renewed. The scars of the past ordeal were still visible, faint marks on fence posts where repairs had been made, the occasional flinch from Thunder when startled. but they served as reminders of resilience rather than pain. For Arthur, these imperfections told a story, one of courage, determination, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. The open days at the ranch became a cherished tradition in Meadowbrook, drawing visitors not only from neighboring towns, but also from farther away. Families brought their children to marvel at the majestic horses, while aspiring riders sought advice from Arthur on how to build trust with their own animals. Each interaction reminded Arthur of why he loved this life so deeply. It wasn't just about caring for horses, it was about sharing that connection with others, teaching them to see the world through kinder, more compassionate eyes. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, Arthur stood beside Emily near the paddock, watching a group of kids take turns riding a gentle mare named Daisy. Their laughter echoed across the fields, mingling with the sound of hooves against soft earth. "You've done something special here," Emily said, her voice warm with admiration. "Not just for the horses, but for everyone who comes here." Arthur smiled, though his gaze remained fixed on the scene before him. "This place has always been about more than me," he replied thoughtfully. "It's about giving people, and animals, a safe space to belong." His words carried weight, born from lessons learned during the darkest days of the ranch's recent history. Protecting what mattered most hadn't been easy, but it had reaffirmed his purpose. In town, attitudes toward Arthur shifted subtly but significantly. Those who had once doubted him now spoke of his unwavering dedication with respect. Even Margaret, the elderly woman who had visited during the first open day, became a regular presence at the ranch, often bringing homemade pies as tokens of gratitude. "You remind us all what it means to stand by your values," she told him one afternoon, her hands busy knitting a scarf for the chilly winter ahead. Sheriff Daniels, too, continued to check in periodically, ensuring that no lingering threats loomed over the community. Though Victor Kane remained behind bars, Arthur never let his guard down entirely. He installed additional security measures around the property, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. The ranch wasn't just his home. It was a sanctuary for those who relied on its peace and stability. On quiet evenings, Arthur often found himself sitting alone on the porch, listening to the distant whinnies of horses and the rustle of wind through the trees. These moments of solitude gave him time to reflect, not just on the challenges he'd faced, but on the growth that had come from them. He realized that protecting his horses wasn't just about keeping them safe. It was about preserving the harmony of the life he'd built. Every hoofbeat, every sunrise, every smile from a visitor reinforced his belief that even in the face of adversity, hope could prevail. Winter arrived, blanketing the fields in a soft layer of snow. The horses frolicked playfully, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. Arthur watched them from the barn door, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Life wasn't perfect. It rarely was, but it was enough. More than enough. As he closed the barn doors for the night, Arthur paused to glance back at the sprawling ranch bathed in moonlight. This land, these animals, and the people who shared in its joys and struggles, they were all part of something greater, something worth fighting for. And as long as he drew breath, Arthur knew he would continue to protect it, one day at a time.